what if we can consider an emotion that comes up for us as a clue to look a little deeper? Hey everyone, I'm Sonia. Welcome. On this channel, I give you tips and strategies to heal your attachment style and to have a fulfilling life and fulfilling relationships. And if you'd like to receive some further tips and strategies from me, go ahead in the description box and sign up for my mailing list. So, today I wanted to talk about emotions as clues for us, clues to further insight and work that we can do. So, in general, one underlying principle here is that we're not suppressing emotions, right? So emotions in and of themselves can be a valuable way of processing in our bodies, letting that emotional energy move through us. So this video isn't focused on that, but I do want to mention that because, of course, emotions are important in our processing of our lives and what's going on with us. But in this case, I'm talking about something else, how emotions can be these clues to what's going on with us. And so I'm going to share with you 4 ways that this might look in terms of what's coming up and what's underlying when you have a particular emotion. And then I will share some sort of steps for taking if you notice that you're having a particular emotion. And of course, it's important to realize that emotions, we often think of them as, something that we consider sad happens. Let's say someone in our family dies, and then, anyone would be sad from that situation. So there's certain emotions that we associate with certain kinds of things happening. But especially when it's these kinds of emotions that maybe we don't even so directly see what's causing them, it's important to realize that people can have different reactions, different emotions to different kinds of things. So the same person could have, various kinds of emotions for a given event. And then on the other hand, if you had several people, maybe they would have different reactions to different kinds of events. So you could have one person, for example, become frustrated or angry by something that's happened that makes another person have the emotion of sadness. So it's just important to realize that sometimes it's not so obviously one-to-one as to what the causes are, which kind of points right to wanting to understand what is underlying. Okay, so what are some examples for what it might mean if you experience a particular emotion? So one way that a particular emotion may be serving as a clue for you for something underlying is that it could be triggering a particular limiting belief. And so let me give you an example. So that could be something like a limiting belief that a particular other person in your life doesn't care about you because they're not calling, right? So why is that a limiting belief? It's a limiting belief because it's possible that that's not true in that particular situation. But it is this belief that you have within yourself around it. And so if you have an emotion, like let's say sadness, but it could really be anything. It could be anger, it could be all kinds of things. It's not so important what the particular emotion is, but if you notice you have this particular emotion when they're not calling as much as you want, it could be that you have a limiting belief about what that means. All right, a second way that an emotion can be a clue for something underlying is when the emotion is pointing to a core wound that you have. So there's a variety of core wounds that different people have. Often it's related to your attachment style as to which particular core wound you have. There are things like I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not safe is kind of a big underlying one, meaning not just physical, but emotional safety as well. Anyway, there's a bunch of them. But sometimes when we have a particular emotion in a situation, it can trigger one of these core wounds being activated. And often this is subconscious. Often we're not thinking the words directly, I'm not enough or something like that. But sometimes we're more aware of it if we've done some work on our core wounds, then we might have more access to what might be coming up for us. So that's another way that an emotion that's happening, sure, it can still be processed, but it could be pointing to something that's getting triggered, like a core wound. And so one example could be something like that we feel like we're not autonomous. So let's say we have a core wound about not being independent or autonomous. And if someone else jumps in to do something for us, that could trigger a core wound that we had, let's say in the past, that's how we felt growing up or something. And then someone does something small like that in the present, that could be triggering that core wound around autonomy. All right, and that kind of directly leads into a third way that there can be this underlying cause that then is creating an emotion in us, which is that it can be sometimes triggering a memory from the past. Usually this is related in meaning, though not always. I'll tell you how that can look in a moment. But in this case, it's more about the association. So, for example, let's say you start to feel nervous or scared when someone's talking to you, and it's really that their tone is, you're not actually unsafe, but let's say their tone reminds you of your emotionally abusive father who did yell at you and hadn't had maybe a similar tone. Maybe this person isn't yelling, but they just have something about that tone that reminds you of your father. So often we're not conscious of that. But if you notice in a situation that you're feeling a certain way, in this case scared, it could be that it's triggering a memory from the past like that. And like I said, occasionally this can actually happen with something associated to a past memory that isn't really meaningful. Like, let's say you went to an event with your mom every month and you were ignored, and that was kind of how she treated you in general. And so you didn't like being ignored by all the ladies, and they always wear fancy hats. And so you start to have these feelings and you don't know why whenever you see someone in a fancy hat. So sometimes it doesn't sort of have that meaning connection. It is really more of an association. But often it is something more like the father's tone and the other person's tone, where it's easier to, if you think about it, sort of realize what might be the trigger around that past memory that's creating the emotion. And then finally, the last way that I want to cover today for how an emotion might be a clue to something underlying is around something else that's just lingering. So it could be that sometimes the most obvious way this often will look, right, is that let's say we were having a really hard day and then something else happens that we get very emotional about later in the day that maybe we might notice that it feels unwarranted in terms of level, right, for the amount of emotion that comes up for us. And it's really because there's this lingering emotion from earlier in the day when things were hard. So that's kind of maybe the most obvious way it can look, but it can be more subtle than that sometimes. So it could be that there's something lingering sort of in your system, like some emotional processing that still needs to be done. Perhaps you had to suppress it at the time because you were at work or out and about, or you just didn't tune into it. So it could be that there's something lingering, and really when you're having an emotion in the moment, it's not as much about that specific circumstance that's happening, but more about that emotion that still is lingering from before. And that reminds me a little bit actually about a video I did, a kind of this quirky video I did about my dog and his phobia of doorways, and how that's much worse when he's just gotten a treat. And it's because his system's already ramped up. Sometimes our systems can be ramped up for another reason, and then it affects something else. In that case, for him, the phobia being harder to deal with when his system's ramped up for a good reason of getting a treat. So there's kind of a parallel there with lingering emotion, and that may be why we have a bigger reaction to something later. All right, so what are some steps we can take if we notice we're having an emotion in a particular moment or in a particular scenario? So noticing is a lot of it, right? We want to notice those feelings, and often that means being in touch with our body. So sometimes people will say it's important to name the emotion, and sometimes we're able to say a sadness or frustration, but it could be a mix of things, or maybe we can't identify it. We just know we're feeling something. And so I think a good way to both tune in further to the emotion and to bypass if we can't quite name it is to see how it feels in our body. So it really means being in tune with our bodies. Where are you feeling it? This can even help us sometimes realize we're having an emotion. So sometimes you might have the physical sensation first, and if you tune in, you realize it's an emotion. For example, someone who doesn't think they feel anger may realize in certain situations they always get really tight, or like there's like a stone in the pit of their stomach or something, and then they eventually realize, oh, that's anger. So important to tune in, notice the emotion, but often that means tuning in to your body and where are you feeling that? How are you feeling that? And then if you want to explore some possibilities, like I think the most important question to ask is, what are you making it mean? In the situation that's happening, assuming something happened, even if it was small, like what's going on in the situation. What am I making it mean right now? Either that I'm having the emotion, or like what's happening currently, or what just happened. Trying to think of like what kind of meaning is going on in your brain. Trying to notice. Sometimes those thoughts are like, I think I had another video actually about not realizing I had an inner voice for a very long time, like where people say you can have this negative inner voice and all this, because it sometimes is pretty hard to catch. But if you can try to notice the thoughts you're having, especially sort of those background subconscious ones, like more subconscious but not fully subconscious ones, if you can sort of notice, so those background thoughts, that can sometimes clue you in, particularly to a limiting belief and possibly to a core wound, although core wounds kind of aren't always in words, but sometimes a limiting belief can also point back to a core wound. So see if you can figure out, or maybe that you have something that triggers you from the past and you do make the connection, but see if you can go in and see what is running through your mind when you have had that emotion and you've noticed it and felt into it. And then, consider just possibilities. If you weren't able to identify it, just consider the possibility that it's making you have some meaning around something, even if you don't know what that is yet, or that it's about something that maybe isn't currently happening in the situation. So think of it as exploring the possibilities, but not getting too set on any particular one, partly because sometimes we have multiple things that are causing the emotion, and partly because sometimes the first thing we're thinking of isn't even the one that's the deepest. But it doesn't matter so much, like I said. It's really more around understanding that we're having the experience of having the emotion, and that it could be that our mindset or a memory is either making the situation feel more emotional in this particular way, or that it's triggering the emotion in the first place. And I want to mention too, because I'm making it sound like it's not the current situation causing anything. It could very well be that the current situation is something that needs to be dealt with. So let's say it is a spat you're having with your partner, and you're having very big emotion around it. It still can be useful to say, what am I making this mean, right? Because that doesn't mean you don't still need to resolve having the argument you're having, but it can be helpful to see if it has lots of meaning for you that doesn't necessarily, like someone else would have completely different meaning, right? For it, that's how you kind of know that it's not the full truth, right? It's how you're interpreting the situation. And so, having sort of explored that a bit, however much you've come to some ideas about what you're making it mean, just working with that present moment. So if you do notice a limiting belief, you could do a little mindset work right in the moment to remind yourself, okay, this is a different situation, or this doesn't necessarily mean that. You may want to do further work going forward around a limiting belief or a core wound, of course, because they usually are more continuous. We can't just solve them in the moment. But I think the mindset shift in the moment, however much you have the context of why you're having the emotion, or why you're having it to the extent that you are, is just to realize that you're going to sort of pull apart a bit what's actually happening in that moment, and the fact that there can be pieces of your psyche that are activated right now that don't directly have to do with the moment. So the reason that can be helpful is both to have something to work on for the future around a limiting belief, for example, but also because then you'll see for the moment at hand what's actually needed there, right? And none of this is, again, about suppressing an emotion. That actually leads into my next step, which is that if you have to do some nervous system regulation, that's an important thing to realize and to go ahead and do it. So let's say you're in this spat with your partner and you feel like you want to take some time to regulate before you continue the conversation. That can be a really important thing to do, but it's distinct from suppressing an emotion. So suppressing an emotion is not letting yourself feel it. It's like you're trying to almost numb it out in your body, or ignore it, or avoid it. You're not tuning into it. Nervous system regulation doesn't mean you're not tuned into an emotion in your body. It's a separate thing where you're taking the time for yourself and like letting some actual, deep, whether it's deep breaths or otherwise, you're just letting your system get regulated. So if your sympathetic nervous system is really ramped up, for example, you're going to let that get calmed back into parasympathetic. You can still be sad while you're in the parasympathetic nervous system. It's true, something like fear or anger will feel less intense when your nervous system is regulated, but it's still not the same as suppressing it. And then, of course, the final step that I somewhat mentioned already would be to do further work when you're not in the situation on whatever you found out. If you found out that there's a core wound, um, or a limiting belief that you'd like to work on, you can do some work around that, whether it's with a therapist or a coach, or some other way of doing that. There's a lot of content online as well, and some courses and things that you can take as well. And sometimes a clue that you might need a little more help than just doing it on your own is if the feeling still feels really mysterious, and so you feel like you need someone else to be like helping to draw out of you and figure and question it and figure out what that really is, that can be helpful. If you're not sure what the underlying cause is, but it's maybe happens several times, or it was a time that particularly bothered you, or if you feel like stuck around resolving it, if it just you just have more of that stuck feeling, or like a confused feeling around it, that also can be a clue that you might need a little more assistance. So hopefully this was helpful. I think if we can start to realize that emotions, first of all, once we do feel them, they often do pass through. And if they don't and are lingering, then we might need some more assistance with them. But also realizing that they can be helpful, that they can be these clues and pointers to ways that we can do some work and some mindset shifts that will lead us to have an even more fulfilling life.